My name's Kyle Robertson. I teach in the philosophy department here, and I'm the assistant director of the Center for Public Philosophy. And we're really excited, as part of our social and political philosophy course, to be participating in the Right Livelihood Conference. This, for those who don't know, this is my normal class time, and many of these young people are my students, so they had to come here. I'm, I'm just going to briefly introduce the two laureates we have speaking to us today, and then move on to their talks as quickly as possible. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Paul Walker. Dr. Paul Walker is one of the most effective advocates for the abolition of chemical weapons. His leadership has helped to safely and verifiably eliminate more than 55,000 metric tons of chemical weapons from six declared national arsenals. He has been key to leveraging over $1 billion annually in effective programs for arms control, disarmament, threat reduction, and non-proliferation. Paul Walker has engaged government leaders, NGOs, think tanks, and citizens groups around the world to work towards full implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and for a world free from the dangers of chemical weapons. So Paul's going to speak to us for about 20 to 25 minutes first, and then we're going to hear from Robert Bilott. So Robert graduated with a law degree from The Ohio State University in 1990. Since then, he has practiced law with the firm Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister LLP, where he has been a partner since 1998. The last 20 years, he has led a legal battle representing 70,000 citizens whose drinking water had been contaminated with, and I'm not going to say this right, but perfluorooctanic acid by the chemical giant DuPont. At a time when environmental regulation is under serious threat of being watered down in the United States and elsewhere, Bilott won compensation for his clients and continues to call for better regulation of toxic substances. So we're going to hear from both of them, and then hopefully we can all participate in a conversation together about their presentations. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Walker.
I have to lower this down a little bit. Kyle's got a little bit of height on me, I think. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Paul Walker. As Kyle said, really delighted to be here, particularly, holding the stage with Robert Bilott, that you'll hear from in a few minutes as well. We're also here with about a dozen or more Right Livelihood Award laureates, and all of us have received this really honorary award over somewhere between 1983, I think, was one of our colleagues, and I received it in 2013. So we're very grateful to the Right Livelihood Award laureates and colleagues for organizing this, to the Right Livelihood College here, and also to Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz for collaborating with the Right Livelihood program, and Kyle too, for you for taking care of this program today. I'm going to talk about chemical weapons, and that's a bit of an exotic topic, as we say. There aren't many people who know much about chemical weapons, and I didn't know much about chemical weapons myself until about 25 years ago. I was working on the Armed Services Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we were right at the end of the Cold War, first few years of the post-Cold War period. It was the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. And I was working under a new chairman of the Armed Services Committee, a fellow named Ron Dellums, and some of you probably know that. He's from Oakland, California. He's the former mayor of Oakland. Yeah, some people I see know. And I had volunteered with him, written speeches and testimony and all for probably 10 years at that point. And I was teaching peace and conflict studies at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. As we say in Massachusetts, Worcester, Massachusetts. And you'll probably hear a little Boston accent. I'm from Boston, and still once in a while, resort to some Boston accents. And Ron called me and just said, "Would you come down and help me organize this committee?" We had a $225 billion a year military budget at that point, 25 years ago. And this was the end of the Cold War. All our enemies had disappeared. The Soviet Union was gone. We really didn't know how to spend the money, and this is an enormous amount of money. And so I had two and a half years on the committee when we really tried to ask the basics as to what do we need, how many military bases do we need, what's the threat, what's the forces we need going to cost, and what do you do? So I covered absolutely everything. I covered everything from aircraft carrier procurement to jet fighter procurement, to, interestingly, military base closure and cleanup. And we went through 5 rounds of base, what was called base realignment and closure commissions, or BRAC, B-R-A-C. And we closed 500 military bases in the United States. I never realized at the time we even had 500 military bases. And we have another 500 still working. But one of the biggest challenges in those military bases, which continues today, is that all of them were absolutely filthy from the capital-intensive industrial type nature of military forces. When you have aircraft and tanks and armored personnel carriers, and you're shooting, practicing shooting M16 rifles and all the rest, it just takes a toll on the environment and on the bases themselves. So I realized back then, even though my field is international security, and I did most of my work prior to that in nuclear weapons and arms control and disarmament, and I served in the military back during the height of Vietnam as well. I realized back then, here we are trying to resize the military, spend American taxpayer dollars in a cost-efficient, honest way, and yet we have this enormous military that was prepared really for the Vietnam period and then downsized a bit for the Cold War period. We didn't need all the forces we had. We didn't need all the weapons we had. We really had a very tough time, I think, figuring everything out. And I suddenly realized that a lot of this military spending is simply for jobs and economy back home, not actually to face real military threats. One of the issues I undertook in 1994 was to organize and do the first on-site inspection of a Russian chemical weapons stockpile site. And we flew over with an Assistant Secretary of Defense and a couple of congressmen. There were 2 of us as staffers running the inspection process. We met with the head of the Russian chemical weapons program back then, a fellow named General Petrov, and they flew us out to Siberia, 3 hours east of Moscow, to this very remote area. And I'll show you a couple pictures of this in a minute. And we did an inspection. We went into a top secret military site, not on any maps, called Shucha in the Kurgan Oblast of Russia, right on the Kazakhstan border. It was surrounded by 14 villages of Russian peasants in a very agrarian economy, in collective farms there. And in this base, which had an officers' club that we stayed in for the night, a couple nights, were 5,400 tons of VX nerve agent. And this agent, which is some of the most deadly chemical substances on Earth. One drop on your skin will kill you in about 2 minutes, or if you breathe it in or ingest it in some way. These were in 2 million artillery shells, in 1,000 missile warheads with mini munitions in it. And the Russians had agreed to get rid of this base, along with their other 6 chemical weapon bases as well. So, big challenge. There was almost no security on this site when we were there. They had one little 16-year-old Army private in the front gate with, hadn't been paid in 6 months, had no weapon at all. And these were located in dozens of corrugated metal, old, decrepit corrugated metal and wooden warehouses or barns, kind of with big barns, swinging doors on the front, and a bicycle padlock on the front. And as we went in, we all went in. We had gas masks, trained with gas masks, and we had hypodermic needles with atropine, which you have to get hit by, punch you in the butt if you start to show impacts of nerve agent. And we went in, and I said to the commanding officer at the time, the General Petrov, how many weapons do you have here? We knew from intelligence that it was a couple of million weapons. And he said, I don't know exactly. He said, it's like 2 million, give or take 1,000, And I said, well, don't you count them? And he said, no, we just keep the doors locked. You saw the padlock on the front door. Everything's fine, So fortunately, the Russians joined the Chemical Weapons Convention that I'll mention briefly, and 4 years later, the OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Convention inspectors, did an on-site inspection, inventoried with computer barcodes and everything, the whole site. And this site has now been destroyed, which is great, big step forward. But let me, I'm going to use about 30 slides I'm going to go through quite quickly. And try to walk you through this, giving you some background. If you can see under the sunshine here, this is a picture from World War I. And the only point I want to make here is chemical weapons have been used a lot over the last century. And the biggest use of them was possibly in World War I, when the Germans on April 23rd, 1915, attacked Allied troops outside a town called Ypres. And you saw or sometimes called Ypres in the West. And this is what happened. A lot of the chemical weapons back then, the first major use by the Germans was chlorine, which is a common, industrial chemical all over the world. It's used in swimming pools and sewage treatment and things like that. A lot of troops were not killed because these were strong but not deadly chemicals. And a lot of them were blinded, particularly later when mustard was used. This is a picture taken from Western troops hit by mustard agent in World War I. Come on, come on. Not really moving. Here comes AV, but let me say, you can see the first couple bullets there. In World War I, there were about 90,000 troops killed with chemical weapons. Everyone went forward, including the Americans, the British, the French. Everyone went forward and used and developed chemical weapons. And they were, oh, there you go, it's moving, wonderful. And it was April 22nd, actually, I'm sorry, I got the date wrong, rather than 23rd. These were not this wasn't weaponized chlorine, it was actually gas cylinders of compressed chlorine gas. 5,700 cylinders the Germans moved into the trenches. This was trench warfare back then. If you ever have a chance to go visit Ypres in Belgium, please do so. I was there and spoke at the 100th anniversary of the fight here in 1915. And it's a wonderful city. And there is this gate that you see pictured there called the Menin Gate. And since, I think it's the mid-1940s, there's been every single day an evening anniversary in commemoration of all the dead in the trench warfare of Ypres back then. So it's actually a wonderful, very moving ceremony. As a result of the use, the sort of horrible and horrors of use in World War I, all the nations came together and did something called the 1925 Geneva Protocol. And the Geneva Protocol banned chemical weapons, banned the use of chemical weapons. If you read those bullets there, it basically shows you that the weapons were banned, so they couldn't be used in the future in any sort of warfare situation, but you could still research, develop, and produce and stockpile them and test them as well. So it really didn't deal with what we call RDT&E, research, development, test, and evaluation. It was, still big steps to go forward to really eliminate chemical weapons. And you'll see even President Roosevelt in 1943, the United States had not ratified that treaty, that protocol by them, said the use of such gas weapons has been outlawed by the general opinion of civilized mankind. The United States ratified the treaty actually in 1976. It took us 50 years to get around to really joining this treaty. We still have chemical weapon threats. That's why we dealt with it on the Armed Services Committee in the early 90s. We had the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s that we have a lot of victims from. Saddam Hussein fired chemical weapons against all the Iranian troops. So Iran today is a very strong proponent of banning chemical weapons, and there are all sorts of victims groups from Iran that we work closely with. Saddam Hussein in Iraq used chemical weapons on his own citizens in northern Iraq in Halabja and all the villages surrounding Halabja, which is mostly Kurdish area. So the Kurdish population in Iraq and Turkey and Armenia all are very strong against chemical weapons. We've had the mayor of Halabja, a very nice fellow, come to The Hague and speak several times. 91 Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons at that time, and the United States and allies pretty well bombed out Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons capability. And I'll mention later, Saddam was left with two big bunkers the size of Egyptian pyramids, the size of a football field, left with all the detritus from all the leftover stuff from his chemical weapons program. Aum Shinrikyo, in terrorist group in Japan in 1995, used sarin nerve agent, which we see used in Syria today, against Japanese citizens, and didn't do a very good job. And part of using chemical weapons is how best to deploy it in a really effective killing manner. Best as a vapor, if you can vaporize it, and spread it out. If we had, it coming across the lawn here today, would all be dead very quickly in a couple of minutes. The Japanese Aum Shinrikyo group was only effective in killing about a dozen people, and they wounded 5,000 who were injured in the subway attack, but that was all through panic and chaos that took place. It wasn't because of the sarin agent at all. And I could tell you a lot more about that story too. All the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Islamic State, have all threatened to use weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological, radioactive weapons. So we're still very worried about non-state actors in this whole process. And then, of course, the Syrians have used chemical weapons starting in 2012, even though the Syrians themselves and President Bashar al-Assad absolutely denies that he's ever used a chemical weapon or has any chemical weapons today. But we'll come back to that. Chemical Weapons Convention. Those of you who are in international law, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which most people are completely unaware of, even chemists and biochemists and a lot of academics in this field, is one of the strongest, most successful, most universal international treaties in the world. There's 192 states parties. We only have 196 countries in the world, so we're missing only 4 countries from the treaty. It's got the largest number of participating countries except for the United Nations, which is very slightly larger. The United States and Russia both ratified it in 1997. There was a big fight in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. We were very active in helping ratification. And 8 countries have declared, under the CWC, chemical weapons stockpile. And these are the countries here. So you'll have just a quick, I can talk in much more depth about all this if you want later. And if you have questions, if anything's really, uncertain or curious about it, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to stop and answer questions too. Russia was the biggest declaration of 40,000 metric tons at 7 stockpiles in Russia. The United States came in second place here, so to speak, with 31,500 U.S. tons or 28,600 metric tons at 9 stockpiles all over the United States. And I'll show you a map of both Russia and the U.S. in a minute. India declared about 1,000 metric tons. South Korea, 600. Libya, 26. Albania, 16. Iraq doesn't know what it had or has. But we had the 2 big old Saddam Hussein bunkers that they declared. And then Syria declared 1,308 metric tons. This is, by the way, graphically a little bit off because I think my program switched from a PC to a Mac here. So if some of this is a little bit screwy, I apologize for it. And I would say, too, there are a lot more countries who invented and tested and deployed chemical weapons. We probably have 3 dozen, maybe, at least in the world. But all of those countries destroyed or got rid of their chemical weapons stockpiles before the Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force. And the Russians and Americans actually had much larger stockpiles as well at many more sites. But they knew from the late 1980s that they were going to unilaterally and reciprocally destroy their stockpiles. And they actually got rid of their stockpiles, a lot of it, probably the majority of the stockpiles, before the treaty entered into force. And I'll talk about where those old stockpiles went in a minute too. United States, here you can see 9 stockpiles. 2 of them are in red. I don't know if you can see that on the screen or not, but we've destroyed every one of these stockpiles except 2 now, since 1990, which is an enormous, hopeful step forward. The 2 left, one is in Bluegrass, Kentucky, right upwind of the Kentucky Derby and all the tobacco fields in Kentucky. And the joke around that stockpile was the tobacco farmers would always say, we don't want anyone burning VX nerve agent upwind of our tobacco. We don't want any toxicity in our tobacco at all. And we always joked about nobody would want to hurt the Kentucky Derby and the horses, you know, all things. And then there's a large stockpile of mustard agent in Pueblo, Colorado. And that stockpile has begun now operating as of about a year ago. And I can go into depth. I visited all these stockpiles, either a very lucky guy or a very unlucky guy, however you look at it. And I visited all the Russian stockpiles too. So I've gone inside all the stockpiles over the last 20 years. You can't read, given the light and the distance, I'm sure, of those, but those are 7 Russian stockpiles. Moscow is kind of in the middle left of that picture. And the easternmost stockpile, you'll see up in the right-hand side, there's a place called Shucha. And that's in, as I said, in the Kurgan Oblast. That was the original stockpile I visited, representing the U.S. government and the U.S. House of Representatives back in 1994. All of these stockpiles now are gone. As of last September, the Russians completed the first stage destruction of their stockpile. So that's, you know, another very good news story. This is what the stockpile looked like in Shucha in Russia in 1994 when I visited there. You can see it, big kind of wine racks going as far as the eye could see with 5 different caliber artillery shells, a VX, every weapon filled live with VX nerve agent. And any one of these weapons of the 2 million in that stockpile, you know, could have killed a good part of a stadium or a basketball court or an auditorium. This was an event we held in Shuchi in 2002, and I only show you this because the Russians, this was 20 kilometers away where we were going to build the big chemical weapon destruction facility, and the Russians brought up the artillery shells you can see on the right-hand side, 5 calibers of that, and those are things you could, you know, put in a briefcase or a gym bag and walk away with. So we were very worried about proliferation and theft and diversion and all. And then on the left are the big missile warheads, which were on railroad dollies that could be rolled out of the stockpile off to the battlefield, wherever that might be. And those fit on, you know, those are big. Those are probably, you know, 1,000 pounds each, and fit, you know, they probably fit in a fiberglass traveling container, railroad container, you see, and about 6 feet, maybe 6-7 feet tall. I asked the commanding officer there if these were training weapons in 2002 when we were there. We had 250 press there from all over the world. CNN, Jill Doherty, if you know CNN, was there, and Jill picked up one of the artillery shells to do a live broadcast on CNN. And the commanding officer leaned over to me and he said, "You probably should tell, you know, Miss Doherty to put the weapon back down on the table." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Those are all live weapons." And I said, what do you mean live weapons? We're in the middle of it. 250 press people from all over the world here, and American and European dignitaries and everything else. And he said, "Well, we just brought them up. You know," he said, "they're not leaking. We checked them all. You know, they're fine." And I said, "But if any one of these leaked, you'd kill everybody here in a minute or two, you know." He said, "Well, you know," I said, "how'd you get them up here?" He said, "We just threw them in the back of a pickup truck and drove them up." And so I said, here we are 8 years after we were very worried, you know, visited this stockpile, and we talked to the Russians about security and safety and public health and worker precautions and all the rest. And they're still throwing live VX nerve agent weapons in the back of a pickup truck and driving them up in a Siberian highway, you know, 20 miles. Unbelievable. So it's a Mac. I don't use a Mac, so I have no idea what I'm doing here. But we'll let the AV. I'll wait till the next slide comes up if you can get it up to me. It's a tiny little slide at the top of the it somehow exited the. There we go. Okay, so. We'll talk about the U.S. program. And I'm going to go quickly now because I know we only have a few minutes left. You know, the real hopeful sign is we've destroyed overall 96% of the declared chemical weapons in the world. About 68,000 tons so far. An enormous accomplishment. In the United States, this is a picture from Umatilla, Oregon, by the way, that I took a long time ago. We've destroyed about 26,000 metric tons, about 91% of the U.S. stockpile. It's really been a very expensive, dangerous, complicated, very demanding operation. 7 of the 9 stockpiles are closed. We've spent over $35 billion in the United States to date. I mean, it's one of the most expensive weapons-related programs, but you know, the weapons guys say to me, but this doesn't get us any defense. You know, this doesn't relate to the battlefield. I said, listen, if we can, you know, save American lives by destroying these dangerous, leaking, you know, insecure stockpiles, it's an enormous step forward in security, however you look at it. Russia, that's a picture from one of the Russian weapons stockpiles, and one of the sites with aerial bombs with live VX nerve agent inside. And you'll see the Russian program actually went faster. The Russians only started 12 years after we started, and they finished last year. So they destroyed almost double the number per year as we have in the United States. And the reason for that is a lot of their weapons were, unlike the ones I showed you at Chucha, this is a whole different stockpile, a place called Pochep, and they were big bombs, spray tanks, aerial bombs like this, with no explosives, no rocket propellant, no dangerous items in the bomb except the agent, of course. And so they could actually work in a non-armored, you know, explosive protected environment in just protective suits. And they're neutral. They're actually introducing hot water and sodium hydroxide into the bomb. And then it's like, you know, shake them up like a cocktail. They roll them back into the warehouse, let them cook. It's exothermic and cooks itself kind of and heats up and self-destructs in a neutralization process. It's a very, very simple, very easy process. And I'll just mention here, Albania destroyed their 16 tons in 2007, and they never knew they had a stockpile, by the way. They came to the Hague, the OPSW, about 10 years after they had joined, and said, oops, we think we found a warehouse, you know, a little garage actually is what it was. That's a picture of it there, up in the, outside of Toronto, up in the mountains, and we think it looks like chemical weapons. So we're very sorry we didn't declare it when we joined the treaty, but somehow we found this, and luckily it doesn't seem like anyone else has found it since. So they didn't even know they had a garage filled with 16 tons of mustard agent. And there's a longer story to that too, but I won't, because of the time I won't go into it. South Korea, 600 tons destroyed in 2008. It's absolutely top secret as far as the Koreans are concerned. We don't know why, and the South Koreans don't allow their name to be used. So if you go up on the OPSW website, opsw.org, you'll see all the 8 possessor states listed: the United States, Russia, Albania, whatever. But you won't find South Korea. You'll find it'll say another state party. And so the South Koreans still demand absolute secrecy about their stockpile destruction program. But it was destroyed by 2008, fully verified and all. India, 1,000 tons. Libya, 26 tons. Libya, Gaddafi had lied when he joined the OPSW, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and hid a 500 artillery shell stockpile. And after Gaddafi was killed, new government came in. They said, similar to Albania, said, oops, we think we found another stockpile, actually. So Gaddafi was the first to really lie blatantly to the, multilateral organization. Iraq declared these 2 bunkers in 2009. They've just been destroyed. I'm happy to talk about that more. And Syria, I'll have a couple slides in Syria. Maybe a couple actually. I would just mention buried chemical weapons. Where all of the former stockpiles went before the destruction program under the Chemical Weapons Convention was countries either dumped them in the oceans and lakes as well, or they buried them. And it was generally thought, this is part of our environmental awareness raising, I think, over the last several decades. They felt that, weapon systems, dig a big hole, throw everything in, cover it over, no one will ever bother with it, everything will be fine. And so the picture you see on the left is a buried chemical weapon which was found in downtown Washington, D.C. And the picture on the right is of the burial site survey and excavation in downtown Washington, D.C. We have a site in northwest Washington. Those of you who know Washington, the District of Columbia, this is up by American University. And we've had a 25-year program now, which is, I think, spent about $400 million to date, surveying over 1,000 private homes, very wealthy homes. This is where ambassadors and senators live, and all multi-million-dollar homes that unfortunately were built on chemical weapon dump sites. And so we've been going through. We found a few dozen weapons so far, and there's still, I think, 100 homes to go. It's taking forever. With a lot of, you can imagine if someone knocked on your door one day, Army Corps of Engineers, and said, "Pardon me, can we survey your property to see if there are any buried chemical weapons under your home or around in your property?" There's also about 250 suspected burial sites, some in California, where the military says this is public information. We're one of the few countries that will talk about this publicly, that we think dumped chemical weapons are suspected, and we still have only excavated 2 or 3 of these sites. Sea dumped, we dumped somewhere upwards of 400,000 tons of chemical weapons in every ocean of the world. Off the California coast, right outside of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, in Georgia's fishing bank in the northeast. And we know this only because we've been able to locate some documents. And from time to time, fishing boats, particularly on the East Coast, pick up a chemical weapon in their dredging, in their clam dredgers and things like that. So we've had, just a year ago, we had a whole clam dredger crew totally injured with mustard agent all over the boat by coming up on the East Coast in the Georgia bank. It's a big issue in the Baltic, which tends to be a shallower fishing area too. So all the Baltic countries, Denmark and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of those countries are very concerned over this. I'll just mention, I'm going to rush through now because I know I've probably gone overtime a bit already. Syrian chemical weapons, it's a big issue. Even though chemical weapons have been out of sight, out of mind for a long time, in 2013, as you know, there was a big killing in outside of Damascus, a place called Ghouta. 1,400 people were killed by chemical weapons by the Syrian government, even though the Syrian government itself denies it. Syria finally joined the Chemical Weapons Convention under pressure from the United States and Russia. You probably recall in 2013, joined the Chemical Weapons Convention and declared and gave up over 1,300 tons of chemical weapons-related deadly chemicals. They realized they couldn't destroy them in Syria because of the civil war and the violence going on. So they moved them all to the port of Latakia, and they put them on a ship. And that's the picture of the ship on the right, the Cape Ray, which is a merchant marine ship. And they outfitted the ship with two big neutralization plants, and neutralized all the chemicals on board the ship in the middle of the Mediterranean. And that's a picture of the neutralization facility. It's basically a big plumbing operation and mixing tanks. So you drain the tanks of the weapons of the mustard agent or the other agent, mix it with hot water and sodium hydroxide. But you can't, you've got to be very careful, and you produce about 10 times the volume when you do that in a wet chemistry process. This was done with a lot of difficulty, but in the end it was all very safe. And then some of this effluent, the toxic effluent, wound up in the United States, in Texas, to be burned in Port Arthur, right outside of Houston, Texas. Almost every toxic industrial material that Rob will talk about too later goes to Texas, by the way. Texas seems to love accepting anything that's bad as long as they get a good amount of money from it. And we have fact-finding missions about what's going on in Syria today. There have been over 200 chemical attacks in Syria today. We've only been able to investigate a dozen, maybe. And there'll be news coming out in the next week or so about the latest attacks about a month ago. We also had a fellow, Kim Jong-nam, who you see there, half-brother of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, who was killed by two young women in Kuala Lumpur Airport who wiped the two precursor chemicals, one on each cheek, on his face in the middle of the airport. Raced off to the ladies' room, washed their hands very quickly, and he, couldn't figure out, I think, what was going on. And he rubbed his face with this greasy, oily stuff and mixed it himself, unfortunately, as he was trying to wipe it off his face, and mixed it, and therefore inhaled it and ingested a little bit, and he was dead in 15 minutes. So he wound up getting killed. It shows you, I think, what Kim Jong-un in North Korea that we're having a summit with next month is really capable of. And we also learned, we knew North Korea had a 5,000 ton or more chemical weapons stockpile. Now we know it's some of the most advanced nerve agents, VX, which, besides the Novichok that was used in this case. You just touch the pad here, and it immediately disappears off the screen. This is one of the new Macs, I think, that none of us are used to. This is Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, who were hit by a chemical agent called Novichok just 2 months ago in Salisbury, England. And we now know, I was in England last week, and we had an all-day workshop on nerve agents. We now know that the two Russian agents who tried to kill Skripal, who's an ex-Soviet, ex-Russian Soviet agent spy, tried to kill him but failed, ironically. And I can go into that more if you like. This is actually a really disturbing incident where Russia, who just finished destroying its chemical weapons stockpile, has blatantly used a chemical weapon as an assassination effort. And never declared any of this stuff to the OP study. Given the time, I'm going to skip through these and just go to a couple of conclusions, and then we can come back to this too. Issues I'd like you to think about. Technology choice. Big issues about whether you burn these weapons to destroy them, whether you neutralize them in a wet chemistry process. And there's a lot of other technologies we can talk about. Emergency preparedness. Everyone is very concerned where these sites are about what should they do in the worst of cases. Do they have time to be warned? Do they have time to get out? We've been very involved in trying to facilitate community involvement and create citizen advisory commissions and spread enough emergency preparedness, both in Russia and the United States. These are really dangerous, very dangerous, some of the most dangerous operations in the world. If you're, say, 2 or 3 miles downwind, your family, your school, whatever, you'd be a little concerned too, I think, right? Investment and involvement. All the communities wanted a piece of the pie. And each one of these operations in the United States is about a $5 billion operation. It's a lot of money. And so the communities wanted to be involved, and these are pictures of Shuchi in Siberia. Gives you a sense. The first public hearing we organized it as Green Cross, and one of the main roads in Shuchi you see on the left there. I'm not a big fan of Macs. I don't know why, but maybe I just have to practice more with the Mac. I just have a couple pictures, and I'll give you some brief concluding points. There you go. Yep. So maybe I can just give you the concluding points now. There's a picture too I just mentioned about transparency. We truly believe in transparency and community involvement, and we try to empower communities. The pictures you see there, one is on the left of protesters in Russia. If anyone knows they're Russian, it says without community investment there'll be no construction of a destruction facility in Russia. This is at Shuchi again. And then on the right, no VX in TX. No VX, no agent in Texas. It's a protest efforts that have been ongoing in Port Arthur, Texas, which is a very poor black community in Texas, where a lot of industrial waste, including industrial waste from the chemical weapons destruction program, has been going for years. And there's a company there called Veolia Environmental Services, which I always put in quotation marks, which manages a lot of the industrial waste and has helped to manage some of the waste that we brought there from Syria as well. We had big demonstrations in Crete, in Athens, in Rome, in Madrid, and Istanbul back in 2014, protesting the destruction of chemical weapons in the Mediterranean as well. So my concluding slides here. Chemical weapons are no longer viable military weapons, have become really taboo, morally reprehensible, and a dangerous burden. All possessive states, must complete safe elimination of chemical weapon stockpiles in the near term. Primarily the United States. We're the only declared stockpile holder right now, and we still have about 5 years to go in Kentucky and Colorado. All member states must join the CWC, and I sometimes just ask people what states don't belong. Most people have no idea. But the 4 states that still have to go are Egypt, Israel, North Korea, and South Sudan. Protection of the environment, public health, worker safety, and weapons demilitarization is an absolute necessity. And for all you lawyers in the audience, these trump, from my perspective, any legal deadlines and budget limits. You don't want to kill anybody in doing a destruction process. You want to protect lives. If it takes a little more money and an extra 6 months or a year, so be it. That's the whole mindset I think that most of us follow. Transparency, stakeholder involvement, public dialogue, and consensus building are essential to program success. This seems like kind of a no-brainer to everybody today. Back in the 90s, when we discussed this with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Russian military, they were like in Netherland, I mean, it was really amazing to them. They said, you mean we should tell people we're doing something? And we should involve communities? So it's taken us a long time to really get this to sink into the federal authorities in both Russia and the United States, and at the OPSW in The Hague. Third bullet there, abolition of a whole class of weapons of mass destruction is an historic achievement. And last, I'd say threats of accident or terrorist use remain, requiring emergency preparedness, response mechanisms, and first responder training. Non-lethal industrial chemicals such as chlorine, dual-use chemicals, also pose serious risks and can still be lethal, as shown in Syria and Iraq today. And a chemical weapons-free world will still not be devoid, don't kid yourself, of dangerous chemicals that Rob Bilott is going to speak to today too. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Rob, go ahead and speak. See if you had any questions for Dr.
Afternoon. Thank you for having me here. This is my kind of classroom. I'll tell you, it's a beautiful, beautiful setting to talk about some not so beautiful subjects. You've been hearing about chemicals that are extremely We've been talking about chemicals that are extremely well regulated in the United States, and that hopefully none of you have ever been exposed to, for good reason. Right? What I'm going to talk about now are chemicals that probably every single one of you have been exposed to, and probably right now have in your blood, that are essentially still unregulated in this country, but can cause cancer, can cause all kinds of other very serious health effects. Many of you younger folks in the audience, students, probably were born with these chemicals in your blood the day you were born. I'd like to explain a little history of how that could happen, how did that happen in the United States, and what is happening now to try to fix that problem. About 20 years ago, I got involved in some litigation out in West Virginia, for a family who had cattle that were dying from the white foam coming out of a landfill. Took on that case for the family. In the context of that litigation, digging through documents, we stumbled upon the fact that there was a chemical in that white foaming water called PFOA. We'd never heard of this chemical before. Wasn't on any list of regulated federal substances or state substances anywhere. So we asked the company for information. We finally started getting documents, started digging through all these internal documents. And the company we were dealing with in that situation was DuPont, one of the biggest chemical companies on earth. And this landfill that was generating the white foam that the cows were drinking was a landfill that was taking waste from what was the world's largest Teflon manufacturing plant right along the Ohio River in West Virginia. And we're digging through DuPont's documents, and what we saw was this chemical was one of a completely man-made class of chemicals that didn't exist on the planet prior to World War II, but were completely man-made synthetic chemicals that had an incredible stable bond. They didn't break down, so they were pretty useful in industry, and they had gone out into use in the 1950s. And this was decades before there even was a U.S. EPA. U.S. EPA didn't come into existence until 1970. So these were chemicals that had been made well before there were EPA, well before there was any kind of state or federal regulation. And they had been DuPont had been buying one of these, this PFOA material, and then using it to make Teflon and putting it into the landfills, into the water, etc. And what we saw, though, even though it wasn't regulated, the companies had been studying the health effects of these chemicals for many years. And by the 1960s, knew that these chemicals were toxic. And they had known by the 1970s the most disturbing aspect of the chemicals, that they can get into human blood and stay in your blood for long periods of time. They get into the body, they bind to the blood, and then they circulate throughout your whole body. Plus, not only do they stay in you, they build up over time. So every little tiny bit that you get exposed to builds up to higher levels in your blood. So this was known in the 70s. We went out and started then testing drinking water in the surrounding communities, because they knew they not only were using this chemical, they were emitting it into the air, they were discharging it right into the Ohio River, and there were public water supplies all around that area. Went out and sampled those as early as 1984. Found the chemical in the drinking water. And remember, there were no federal or state regulations on this chemical. DuPont scientists, though, were doing more and more studies on the toxicity. They had found out that the chemical caused cancer in animals. It was a confirmed carcinogen in animals. They had done rat studies. They found 2 different studies they had done. The company itself confirmed it was a confirmed animal carcinogen by the 1980s. Caused 3 different types of tumors: testicular, pancreatic, and liver tumors. So DuPont was knowing, though, that this was getting out into the public water. So even though it wasn't regulated, they set their own safety guideline for the chemical in the water. No more than 1 part per billion in drinking water. So they went out and found that it was in the water, though, 2 parts per billion, 3 parts per billion, 5 parts per billion. The company, unfortunately, according to the documents we were seeing, didn't tell anybody that was drinking the chemical in the water because it wasn't regulated. They weren't required under the law. This was still not regulated by state or federal law. So we're seeing these documents and going through all of that and recognizing there's probably a public health threat going on here. There is a toxic chemical that can cause cancer in drinking water for this community. They haven't been told. And what we saw in the documents was it didn't look like the U.S. EPA or the states had been told. There was a federal law that had come out in 1976 called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which dealt with the requirements for providing information to EPA about new chemicals when they come out onto the market. But remember, that's 1976. These chemicals were already out on the market. For existing chemicals, it was up to the companies using the materials to tell EPA if they thought there was a substantial risk to human health for many of the data they were seeing. So what we were seeing in the documents was over and over again the company deciding we don't think there's a substantial risk that we need to tell US EPA about. So even after that law came out, EPA still hadn't known about this chemical, didn't know it was in water, didn't know about the toxicity. We sent a letter to EPA in 2001, alerting them to all of this, thinking that will start the process. We will have some sort of federal level for this chemical in drinking water. But we learned the hard way, that was a very slow process that just started. The community, though, when they found out it was in the water, above the level DuPont even said was safe, they wanted it out. They came to us as lawyers and said, what can you do to help us get the chemical out of the water? And we want to know, what does it do to people? What does it do to us drinking this over time? It causes all these bad effects in these animals. What about us? Particularly if it stays in us so long and we're drinking it day after day. DuPont had looked at humans. They had been looking at workers. And what they saw in the studies were these workers were having some of the same health effects. They were seeing increased cancer. They were seeing increased toxicity effects in the humans. But discounting it on the ground, these weren't a big enough sample size to really draw statistically valid conclusions. Because typically you're dealing with, when you look at workers, they're primarily adult, healthy males. So you have a fairly discrete sample to start with. And then there's probably only a couple hundred or a couple thousand in that group that's being studied. For some of these rare cancers, you need tens of thousands of people to have a statistically valid result. So even though these results were being seen in the workers, DuPont was taking the position, we don't really know if that's really happening in the humans. And even if it is, even if these workers are having these effects, it's certainly, we don't have any evidence to suggest people drinking it at these levels in the water would have the same effects. Because the workers have high exposures. They're in the plant. Problem was nobody was doing the study of the people in the community. So when the community came to us in 2001, we ended up filing a class action lawsuit against DuPont to try to get the chemical out of the water and to try to find out if this is causing harm, what can we do to help the people in the community to get the testing and to find out what it would do to them. US EPA started digging through the documents we gave them. Because what we were getting from DuPont through the litigation, all these internal studies that have never been published, haven't been seen, we were sending those to US EPA and saying, you need to look at this information. By 2002, the US EPA announced that they were going to start a priority review of this chemical. And they may actually ban the chemical under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And at that point, I think only 5 chemicals have ever been banned. So it gives you an idea of how serious EPA was viewing this data that they were seeing about this chemical. So that happens, that comes out in 2002. In 2003, US EPA also starts doing its very first risk assessment. What they do is they figure out this chemical, this is not just a West Virginia small community issue. They look and they start looking at national blood samples that have been taken across the country. And they're finding out that the chemical is being found in about 99.9% of the people across the country that are living nowhere near these plants. So there's suddenly elevated concern here that this is a chemical exposure that's not just West Virginia and Ohio. This is a nationwide chemical exposure. And what we see is EPA starts asking for information about how is this stuff being used, where is it used, what products. And what we learn in the early 2000s, around 2003, 2004, this chemical isn't just used in making Teflon. It's used in making unbelievable variety of products. Things like stain-resistant carpeting, fast food wrapper packaging, microwave popcorn bags, cables. Yeah, it's in just about every consumer product you can imagine. A closely related chemical called PFOS was used in making things like Scotchgard, firefighting foams. So when EPA starts looking through this, there's a recognition this is a huge potential contamination issue. Because the concerning thing about that chemical, keep in mind it's not only in the blood now of everybody in the country. They start realizing they're seeing these chemicals being found in the blood of just about every living animal on the planet. In the Arctic, in polar bears, in Arctic ice caps. Because when this stuff gets up into the air from factories or from emissions of any kind, gets up into the air, travels through the clouds, and basically goes over the entire planet and comes down in the rain. So you're looking at this point, 2003, 2004, recognition that you've got a global contamination issue. Because this stuff, when it's in the environment, does not break down. It stays there for millions of years unless physically removed. And in people, it stays in people. And as long as the exposures are occurring, the levels in your blood keep building up. So in 2004, as this was becoming a bigger issue, we're getting ready to go to trial in our case in West Virginia. And we're going to have to fight about what does this do to people. We sat down with DuPont. We realized this is becoming a big issue, needs to be resolved scientifically with a real scientific answer to what these chemicals actually do to people who are drinking it, because now we have exposure all over the place. We actually said, all right, we're going to take this out of the traditional legal process and do it a new way, a different way. We're going to create a science panel, independent scientists, not affiliated with the company, not affiliated with the evil plaintiffs' lawyers, okay? But these independent scientists that both sides could pick. Either side could veto for any reason. We had to agree these were completely independent, world-class leading scientists, epidemiologists, people who do human health studies. And they're going to look at all of the data that exists, and they're going to determine what does this chemical actually do to people and confirm it. Because what we've been seeing in the studies surely suggested, of course, cancer was an issue, other toxic effects. But in particular, what we wanted to know, what will it do at the levels of the exposure that are occurring here, at the level people are actually drinking? So this panel was told, we want you to look at all the data and tell us, well, drinking this chemical in water, we defined it for at least a year, at the levels that we're having in the community, that were less than a part per billion for some of these communities, is that linked with an actual human health effect? We set that panel up in 2006. And one of the other things, well, I'll come back to this, but what also happened at that point, once we entered into that agreement, DuPont, at this point, EPA had actually sued DuPont, claiming they had withheld all this information about the chemical. If they had given us this information decades ago, we could have begun regulating this many decades ago. DuPont settled that case with the EPA right after our settlement, data fine. DuPont then announced they were going to stop making PFOA in the United States over the next 10 years. Okay? By 2015, this would be phased out. The other chemical, PFOS, I mentioned, the Scotchgard material, 3M had already pulled that off the market back in 2000. 3M had stopped making all of this, PFOA and PFOS, back in 2000. DuPont had stepped in and started making it itself. So DuPont was the U.S. manufacturer at this point. Agreed, we're going to stop making this stuff, which is great. No more of it was going to go into the environment. But the concern was, and I raised with EPA at the time, what about what's already out there? What about what's already been emitted the last 50 years that's likely in soil and water all over the country and in everybody's blood? All right? The EPA's basic response was, that's a legacy issue. It's no longer an issue of a chemical that's out there in commerce that we are going to address. Besides, you're doing health studies. We're going to wait for those results. Okay? So, those health studies then ended up, we had money that was paid by DuPont for a class, $70 million. Rather than just give that to everybody in the class, we proposed, and everybody agreed, and the court agreed with us, that money would be used to pay everybody in the community to come in and have their blood tested and drawn to be analyzed for the chemical, and to provide access to the medical information, so that we would actually have data from a big enough group of people who had actually been exposed so we could confirm these health effects. We ended up getting 69,000 people in that community to participate. All that data was given to these scientists who were allowed to design whatever studies needed to be done to confirm what these health effects were. They designed 12 different studies, some of the most complex, most sophisticated human health studies ever done, with one of the biggest databases ever available. They created big models, retrospective exposure models of how much water they were able to to actually estimate how much water was in each person's home over time, how much was likely in their blood over time, and come up with conclusions about what the health effects were. And this took until 2012. Okay? During this period of time, there's essentially not much happening at all on the federal level with these chemicals. But in 2012, reports came out confirming that drinking this material in the water was linked with 6 diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, preeclampsia, and high cholesterol, which sounds like a weird mix of diseases. But think about the way the chemical behaves in the body. It gets in the blood and it circulates throughout the entire system, every organ being polluted with this stuff over time. Once those links came out, everybody in our community, we had an agreement with DuPont, part of the original settlement. If these links were confirmed, everybody in the community that had been exposed got free medical testing to detect whether they were getting one of those diseases. Medical monitoring. Everybody started getting free medical monitoring. DuPont has to pay that up to $235 million in costs. The other thing DuPont agreed to up front, once these links were found, they would agree not to contest general causation. In other words, for us lawyers, right, that's like the critical thing in proving the chemical is related to somebody's actual disease. And what that meant was DuPont would not dispute that drinking this chemical at that amount for that period of time in the water can cause that disease. All the people would need to prove if they had the disease, it wasn't something else. Okay? So everybody's claims were preserved while the study went on. And when the results came out, these links were identified. Everybody in the community that had one of those diseases, had one of those cancers, and may have died, they then had the right to go forward with injury claims against DuPont. We eventually were able, we had to take some of those to trial, go through all kinds of legal issues. We ended up getting DuPont. By the way, we won every one of the trials against DuPont. And DuPont eventually, during the middle of the 4th trial, settled all of them for $670 million for the people who had those injuries. During that period of time, though, I'm sending this information to US EPA about these health effects. You now have the most comprehensive human health studies done confirming actual human impacts from this chemical. What else do you need to set drinking water guidelines? The stuff's likely in water all over the country. 2012, I'm telling EPA this, here's the results. 2013, EPA says, well, one of the first things we have to do, though, to decide whether or not we can regulate it as a national drinking water issue, something that EPA deals with and not the states, is whether it's a nationally occurring problem. So we need to know, does it actually occur all over the country? So in 2013, for the first time, they started requiring public water supplies to test for the chemical. But only the biggest public water supplies. This was part of a program called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Program, where EPA asked public water supplies to sample for something that really isn't regulated yet. So the public water supply sample for it, the data goes into EPA, but the public water supply does not have to report it to the users because it's not regulated. So this data starts going into EPA in 2013, 2014, and I'm looking at it online, and I'm seeing, sure enough, this chemical and PFOS are being found in public water supplies all over the country. Nobody's being told, though, about it. In 2015, 2016, some publications come out, national media comes out, that mentions the fact these things are being found in public water. News about the trial verdicts of DuPont and this chemical being linked with cancer. Suddenly there are communities across the country that say, whoa, what is this stuff? Why is it in our water? And there it shows up in places like New York State, Vermont, New Hampshire, in places where the governors, the U.S. senators, other representatives start demanding to U.S. EPA, what's the safe level? You need to tell us what's the safe level, and we want a level now. So even though I had asked EPA in 2001 for a guideline on what's the safe level in drinking water, by May of 2016, U.S. EPA came out with the first long-term exposure guideline for these chemicals in drinking water, 70 parts per trillion. When that information came out, a lot of these places that had tested for it were above that. So now people are saying, whoa, we need clean water. Who pays for the bottled water? Who's paying for filtering the water? And the U.S. Department of Defense, when that number came out, recognized one of the things that these chemicals have been used in, remember, particularly PFOS, was firefighting foams. That chemical had been used in hundreds of military bases across the country. The Department of Defense identified hundreds of sites that likely had this stuff and probably had drinking water contamination and started going down a list, testing for it. And in 2016, you started seeing almost every day a new community in the United States finding this chemical in the water. So there was this pressure being put on US EPA about regulating these materials. And at the same time, we had this new issue come up. During that 10-year phase-out of PFOA, the companies and others were told to switch to safe alternatives. So they started doing things, instead of this material that had 8 carbons, C8s, they started creating these replacement chemicals where they took 2 carbons off. And it's a C6, so it's a different chemical. In 2016, not 2017 actually, one of these new C6s, DuPont's replacement for PFOA, showed up in the drinking water in Wilmington, North Carolina. 300,000 people are drinking that material. And the response we heard back, and by the way, there was an the cancer study was done. Same exact 3 tumors that PFOA caused: testicular, liver, and pancreatic. But the response we heard back was, yeah, but there's no human data. Right? So you started to see, wait a minute, we're doing this again. We're starting this cycle all over again. We went through all of this with PFOA, got it phased out, got the human data approved, and now you simply tweak the material and we start this all over again. So what we're seeing now is people recognizing that we cannot address these one chemical at a time. They need to be addressed as a whole class. What we now know is it's not just PFOA and PFOS. Those chemicals are part of this man-made class of what they call polyfluoroalkylated substances, PFAS. There's about 3,000 in that class. We need to be addressing all of them because as humans, we're not exposed to one chemical at a time. We're exposed to lots at the same time. These things may have synergistic effects when they act in your body all at the same time. We need to be addressing what's the total cumulative exposure, let's say. So what we're now seeing, particularly in Europe, people are approaching this because these chemicals are not, as I mentioned, not just limited here. They're showing up in drinking water in Australia, in Italy, in Germany. It's now become a global issue, particularly outside military bases in other countries as well. So people are finding not only the PFOA and PFOS, they're starting to now go out and sample for these replacements, the C6s and C4s, and guess what? They're in the water. So we need to approach these now as a class-wide issue. And I'm happy to say there is a national summit scheduled for next week by US EPA to address this whole issue because of all this that's popping up across the country. And right before the summit, the federal agency that's supposed to be looking at health effects, ATSCR in the United States, they've got a draft ready to come out that's looking at not just 2 of these, but 4 of them. Now that's it may not seem like a big deal, but it's great that we're expanding this at least. Now we're not looking at 1, we're not looking at 2, we're up to 4. It's a step in the right direction. And I think we need to learn from what we went through with PFOA, all the issues, everything that had to be done to get health effects proven for this one chemical. Because in the United States, if you're exposed to these things and you think it might cause a problem, you, the person drinking it, it's your burden to go in and prove that that causes harm. Okay? You're the one who has to fund the health studies and do all of this to prove the harm. So think about that and what the enormous burden would be if we have to go through this for those 3,000 chemicals, just like what was done for this one. So hopefully we'll learn from the experience with PFOA, not repeat those mistakes, be able to use that information, extrapolate it to the whole class, deal with all of them at once, and be able to move forward a lot quicker than 30 years. So I know I've gone a little long, but that's open. Happy to talk about it and answer any questions. Thank you.
yeah, we have about 20-25 minutes for questions. I was going to take a brief moment and invite anyone who's suffering in the sun. I think it's totally fine if we just moved over to the shade. If you'd prefer, it's up to you, but it's hot out there. So I'm going to start off with a question and then just have you all answer questions. One of the class that's meeting at this time is social and political philosophy. Right? So we've been talking a lot about social contract theory or different philosophical theories of how governments are supposed to be organized. Governments owe citizens, who do citizens owe their governments? In the cases you both talked about seem like pretty severe violations of the social contract. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the resistance? Like, Paul, you talked about 1925, right? Talking about why these things are very bad. Why did it take so long? Was there sort of a moral or ideological position to oppose this? And likewise, Robert, like what's the resistance to something that seems so obviously immoral or so obviously a core part of our government responsibility to protect citizens from this type of harm?
In the case of chemical weapons, chemical weapons were never banned until 1993. Actually, 1997, when the treaty entered into force. And as I got involved in this in the early 1990s and studied the history of it, we realized how many, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed with these deadly chemicals, and how they were really, to a large extent, banned in 1925. The United States took till 1976 to join the treaty. I raised some of those questions with workers I met who produced VX nerve agent, for example, in Newport, Indiana. Newport, Indiana, anyone here is from Indiana, probably not. It's right on the western edge of Indiana, right on the Wabash River. And it's a big pharmaceutical company there that has incinerators up and down the border. And this worker at what was called Newport Chemical Corps said to me, the Soviets were building chemical weapons, the Germans, the Nazis were building chemical weapons. I mean, it was really a chemical arms race that was going on. And, at this one site, they had, I think it was 7,000 tons of VX nerve agent in the middle of the country. I said, why would we do this also in Indiana, for example? He said, we were worried about foreign attacks, so we put it in the middle of the country. And it was a giant production facility and storage facility of giant holding tanks of VX nerve agent in the middle of farm fields. You'd never know driving by. You'd think it was some sort of simple warehouse or factory there, but it was holding some of the most deadly material in the whole world. And that was eventually neutralized, and then it was actually, this is a much longer story I won't go into, but it was shipped to Texas, to Port Arthur, Texas, where I talked about environmental justice and this poor black community there, and it was burned in the middle of this community. I think this worker at Newport said to me, it was good jobs. Not only were we competing with the enemies, the Soviets and the Nazis and anyone else, the fascists and all. He said it was good jobs, good pay, high risk job, high pay. I supported my family for a long time. And I said, aren't you glad to get rid of this stuff? He said, no, I kind of prefer if we continue to just produce this, get good jobs and good pay again. So and that was sort of the case in Russia when I went through all the Russian sites too. The people there said, we're sorry to lose, our chemical weapons production facilities. But I think most people didn't think about the larger moral and ethical questions. And it took really, in the 1980s, both the United States and the Soviet Union to realize in bilateral discussions that these were no longer really valid or acceptable military weapons. I'm not trying to say that some weapons are acceptable and these aren't. Because, when you look at Syria, most people, the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed in Syria, were largely killed with conventional weapons, conventional bombardment. Chemical weapons that we're all trying to ban, and we're criticizing Syria about, has only killed probably, a couple of percent of the death and injured in Syria. But I think the Chemical Weapons Convention, when it was finally finished, negotiated, took 12 years to negotiate. And then it was signed by over 100 countries in January of '93, and it was finally ratified by a sufficient number of countries. And the United States snuck in like one day ahead of time, so they could become one of the original members. And there was a big fight in the Congress, and we worked on ratification. We had a lot of congressmen, mostly Republicans, but some conservative Democrats too, saying, but don't we need chemical weapons for deterrent purposes? We should have something on the escalation ladder, so we wouldn't have to fire nuclear weapons. We could hit people with chemical weapons. That might be worthwhile. I mean, just crazy, to my mind, absolutely crazy, irrational reasons. But it's been a long time coming, and now because we feel we've been very successful in destroying and verifying the destruction of 96% of the world's declared chemical weapon stockpiles. We're very troubled by the recent use of chemical weapons in Syria. So Syria continues to violate its treaty responsibilities. Syria is fully backed by Russia. And when I go to The Hague or Geneva, I sit there listening to the Russians who are absolutely and the Syrian ambassadors, absolutely just lying to the rest of the world. And they're quietly backed, as I say, by the Iranians, who are very close allies with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and a little more quietly backed by China and India as well. And then we have the assassination attempt with nerve agent Novichok by the Russians in Salisbury, Italy, just 2 months ago. Unfortunately, Sergei Skripal survived, so the Russians totally botched the assassination attempt. And I can talk a lot more about that if you'd like. And we also have this horrible assassination in the middle of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysian airport a year ago of Kim Jong-nam. Not that I know much about Kim Jong-nam at all, but for Kim Jong-un to assassinate his half brother, he's murdered a couple of other, or had executed a couple other relatives in North Korea as well to eliminate any sort of leadership fights and competition that might go on. It's just absolutely horrible. But North Korea is not a member of the treaty, so they didn't have any, and I actually don't think that they've signed or agreed to the 1925 Geneva Protocol either. So in fact, they didn't really commit any sort of legal violation, but they nevertheless used VX nerve agent, which is the next best thing to Novichok nerve agents. So that's a long answer to a tough question, Robert. Thank you for that question.
Just add a couple of minor points. I think if you ask most people in this country, they would assume that drinking water is safe, that all the chemicals that have of any concern have already been reviewed. Somebody's paying attention to all of that. When you turn on the tap, when you get your report from your local water supply that says we meet all federal and state standards, that means it's clean, it's safe. So I think it's not necessary that people are accepting that this is going on, that there are all these unregulated materials that are getting into the water. I think it's been primarily just not realizing the extent of all these other things that frankly have not been really reviewed. And the other point I was going to make is you talked about some of the attitudes that you look at where some of these plants are located, in particular the community that where the DuPont plant was. That some researchers came back after all of this happened and all the litigation and started interviewing people locally and about their attitudes. About what do you think about the company, or what do you think about the fact that this was in the water? And it was remarkable the culture in these areas. You had people whose response was, "You're gonna die from something anyway." And okay, so it's cancer. In the meantime, we had a good job. So that is ingrained in the culture in some of these areas, particularly in what is called Chemical Valley, through the Ohio River Valley, where a lot of these plants are located. These were traditionally fairly rural, impoverished areas before these plants came in. And everything's named after them. The town square is named after the company. So there's a real attitude that we owe it to these folks who came in and gave us this life. So it's very difficult to overcome.
Two-part question. First would be, in the DuPont case, you said that independent panel of scientists. I was wondering who was funding that, and on the other part of that, it seems like that's what the DA should be doing, unbiased, question is, if the EPA is not doing that, in your opinion, what is the agenda of the EPA?
Under the settlement, we required that the panel had to be completely independent, but DuPont had to pay whatever the cost was. All right, and neither side was allowed to actually have communications with the panel without the other side being present at the copy. All right, so we knew exactly what was going on. The cost, it ended up costing DuPont about $33 million for those studies. And one of the other things I forgot to mention, part of the settlement, was DuPont also had to go in and immediately stop the exposures. They had to pay for water filtration systems in all the impacted communities. And there were about 6 public water supplies, dozens of wells. So that went on first, the treatment of the water to stop that ongoing exposure. But then they did have to pay for all of the studies themselves, whatever it cost. It ended up being a lot more, I think, than what they anticipated. But the federal government was not doing those kinds of studies. There's a federal agency, ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It was created around 1980 as part of the Superfund legislation. Its function was supposed to be to do health studies in the United States in areas where there's been exposure to hazardous substances. And in fact, I've been sending letters to that agency for quite some time, saying this is what you ought to be studying. You ought to be studying communities that are impacted by this. And actually, it was just a couple of weeks ago that some of the first funding ever was allocated to the ATSDR to do a study of these chemicals. 10 million was just allocated under the, I think it's the 2018 Defense Authorization Act, whatever it's called. Yeah, they actually allocated 10 million to the agency to actually start studying. Remember, we've already studied what PFOA does to people, but now we know there's these other chemicals, these related classes. The purpose of that study is to really try to focus on what do these others and the whole mix of them do, particularly in communities near military bases that have these foam exposures. So the money's been allocated, but the study still hasn't even begun. They haven't started it.
I'm in the Department of Philosophy. The Center for Public Philosophy.
Your question is a very good one. We've all asked ourselves too. Why? We answered a little bit earlier too, partly. Why do people do this? But how do we address it? I think as well. And organize to saying no to these types of jobs. Why do we ever produce 40,000, 28,800 tons of chemical weapons here in the United States? We produce much more than that. We dumped most of it, prior to the Chemical Weapons Convention entering into force. I think first of all, as someone who's gone through the whole last half of the 20th century up to today, we had very little concern, I think, over environmental impacts and public health impacts of industrial chemicals and military chemicals at all, up until probably 20 years ago. There's no such thing as environmental studies up until 15, 20 years ago. I never had the option of taking a course called environmental study. There's no program of that nature. So this is all, in a sense, new. And Rob's, discussion about PFOAs. I'm on an email network on PFOAs, believe it or not, and I get an email on a new military base and a new community issue about this toxic material almost every single day. This problem is enormous. And the one thing I learned too when I was working on the Armed Services Committee 25 years ago was that every military base in this country, and we had upwards of 1,000 military bases in the United States at one time, probably even much more than that during the height of the Vietnam War. Every one of those military bases, when you try to close them, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we're closing over 500 military bases in the United States, consolidating, trying to make things more efficient. The Pentagon has asked for more base closure, and the House of Representatives refuses to do it because they want to maintain the money and the defense military income in those areas. Every one of those military bases is really dirty. And so when you try to move it off the Pentagon payroll, basically, and into the commercial economy, and we did things like establish Restoration Advisory Boards, RABs, local redevelopment authorities, LRAs, to get the communities involved and study the base and what should be done with it and build consensus. A very good dialogue process and all. It's impossible to do anything until the base gets cleaned up. And these bases, I had to visit loads of military bases in the 1990s here in the United States. And we had everything from lead paint in the buildings and in the soil surroundings where the local authorities were trying to sell beautiful former military homes with officers to the public. And the lead, when we visited these things, we said, if any of you have been in the military, it's like scraping paint for at least the enlisted officers, which I started off as a private third class in the Army. The lead paint in the soil around these homes was about 100 times the permitted level under state and federal law. It developed in a big fight simply of cleaning up the lead paint and the level of lead in the soil and in the homes themselves. So you never should have bought or even tried to sell one of these homes until you cleaned it up. Now we're facing the battle of these 250 potential burial sites of chemical weapons all over the country. It's about 35 states, including the Puerto Rico and the site in the District of Columbia that I mentioned earlier called Spring Valley. There's a lot of information on the web on that if you'd like, under U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Was the major burial site of chemical weapons after World War I. And there was a big firing range in northwest Washington. You can see the area from the White House, actually. And after World War I, people began to buy plots of land and build homes. And this is where 1,000 beautiful multi-million-dollar homes are now. But we found at least 100 of those homes have chemical weapons on their property, 5, 6, 8 feet deep. And one house, which was used to be used by the president of American University, actually, the Army, about 5 years ago, finally purchased for $2.5 million and tore it to the ground because they still believe that the major trench used to bury chemical weapons after World War I is under the house. And they're drilling down now. It's like a big archaeological dig at this point. Very carefully drilling down and opening up different areas to find chemical weapons. And about 4 months ago, 10 workers were overcome by chemical fumes and had to be rushed off to the hospital. And this is going on. And I'm trying to work with the U.S. military to survey all of these 250 sites and commit more money to what's called the non-stockpile chemical weapons program to make sure that we can clean up all these sites quickly. It's not much different than what Rob's doing, trying to get recognition of PFOA and get scientific tests on all the different water sources and industrial impact. So all I can say is we live in a very industrial society here in the developed West, I guess. and that our ignorance and naivete over the last century to what we've been doing to the environment and also to the human race and every other living being it has really been absolutely disgraceful. And it's going to take a long time, and we're going to have to overcome a lot of attitudes of corporate responsibility as well as government responsibility, both federal, regional, and local, to get all this cleaned up. In the meantime, our cancer rates are out of control in a variety of ways, and it's very difficult to prove causation, as you were very successful, Rob, in your effort, which I'm delighted to see. And fortunately, the U.S. government, has totally accepted the fact that they've got to totally destroy their chemical weapons stockpiles, which we've been working on now for almost 3 decades. And it's costing, as I say, a fortune to do this, $40 billion. If we could have spent that money anywhere else, would have been helpful. And I think in the end they're willing to do this cleanup. But we have 10,000 Superfund sites here in the United States, and ATSDR and the Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. military trying to figure all this out and how we can. It's going to take us centuries to clean this stuff up. In the meantime, we're bearing the burden, I think, the human burden of high cancer rates, toxicity that we don't really know too much about, particularly in these new chemicals as well. Very tough situation to be in, but it's sort of the result, the prices our generations are all paying and future generations will pay for our industrial development and our lack of awareness around protection of public health and the environment.